Hi, welcome to this virtual CRESS event. I am Dr. Michelle Dion, an Associate Professor of Political Science and the Academic Director of CRESS, which is the Center for Research in Empirical Social Sciences at McMaster University. Soon we will be relaunching as SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. I want to begin by acknowledging that McMaster is on the unceded territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So today I am delighted to have with us Tyler Girard. He is a doctoral student at University of Western Ontario, and he is going to be talking to us about a forthcoming or an upcoming paper that will be published in the American Political Science Review. It's all yours.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. I hope all of you are well and you're staying safe right now. I'm really excited to speak with you today about my research on how we measure international norms and my more specific empirical focus in this research on the lesbian, gay, and bisexual equality norm. So let's start with the good news. So LGBT equality is increasingly prioritized by scholars, activists, policymakers, and the broader public. Now, to be clear, in this context, the LGBT acronym is typically understood to represent the broader LGBTQIA+ community. Now, if we look at the United States as one example, with the recent election of Joe Biden, there's this widespread optimism within the community that he's going to pursue a very positive policy agenda that will advance equality goals broadly. If we look at Canada as a different example, there's been recent indication that policymakers are considering a ban on conversion therapy, which has been a long-standing goal within the community. Now, of course, these are just two examples, but I think they're indicative of a lot of change that we're seeing occur across the world. Now, of course, this isn't the full story, right? We're seeing challenges to LGBT equality in all aspects of the world. We're seeing it in Eastern Europe, where we've witnessed direct attacks on the community just within the last year. In many ways, Uganda has become kind of a focal point for resisting or rolling back LGBT rights in non-Western contexts. And in many cases, this isn't just something like countries haven't adopted same-sex marriage, for instance. In many cases, the very right of the LGBT community to exist is under threat. So we can see one type of manifestation of this in two different trends in recent public opinion. So on the one hand, we can see that broad support for homosexuality is fairly common across some Western contexts in North America and Western Europe, and to some extent Latin America. But on the flip side, we're seeing perpetually low levels of support for homosexuality in a lot of contexts in Africa and Asia, as an example. So the purpose of this research and my broader talk today is twofold. First, I'm really interested in how we can improve the way we measure international norm adoption. So as I'll discuss shortly, the study of international norms is a major part of political science research, yet we increasingly, I argue, face this divide between how we theoretically think about norms and then how we empirically study norms. And the second part is, given this new approach to measurement that I'm developing, what can this tell us about the evolution of the LGB equality norm? And so to clarify up front, I use LGB deliberately since the specific focus of the research is on the equality norm as it relates to sexual orientation rather than gender identity or the broader LGBT community. So given the focus of my research in this talk, there are 5 sort of guiding questions that I'm using to structure the conversation today. And my assumption is that some of you who might be watching later aren't necessarily political scientists, let alone scholars of international relations. So I want to start by just making sure we all have a basic understanding of what we mean by international norms. And then I'll turn to whether or not we can perhaps identify a lesbian, gay, and bisexual equality norm. I'll then walk us through briefly how we typically try to measure norm adoption across countries and some of the problems that we encounter in doing so. Then I'll introduce what's often referred to as latent variable models and how they've typically been used in social science research and why I think they're so well equipped to address the problem that we have with measuring international norms. And then in this final section, I'll bring all the pieces together. So what are international norms? Now, I recognize that norms as a concept are fairly widely studied across the social sciences. It's not the unique domain of political science. But at least in terms of international relations, we have this sort of common definition that's often used by Finnemore and Sekink, that international norms are understood as a standard of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity. Their article from 1998 has been cited more than 9,000 times. It's one of the most cited articles in political science. And so clearly there's a widespread interest in learning about and studying international norms. So why do we care about international norms? Well, we expect that international norms will structure how individuals and organizations and countries behave. And since the 1990s, we've increasingly focused on how the meaning of norms can change over time, how norms are translated from global to local levels, and even how Western norms are often resisted or challenged or repurposed in non-Western contexts. So in other words, the key takeaway here is that norms aren't understood to be static or fixed in time. They're dynamic and they can evolve in terms of what counts as the appropriate behavior for that norm and the extent to which the norm is adopted. So it's useful to briefly consider some common examples of international norms that we often talk about. So within the domain of international conflict, we talk about norms related to the treatment of prisoners of war and the non-use of nuclear weapons. In human rights scholarship, we talk about things like gender equality norms. In governance, we talk about there being an anti-corruption norm since the 1990s. Now, I think these are useful examples to consider because they vary, not just in terms of the specific domain in which we talk about them, but they also vary in terms of being either positive or negative norms, whether or not we should adopt certain behaviors, or in the case of nuclear weapons, not do certain things, right? They also vary in terms of the range of actors they apply to. Some of them are more relevant to countries like using nuclear weapons, but other norms apply to kind of everybody in society, like gender equality. Now, is it the case that international norms require formalization? Well, the short answer is not necessarily. We might see formalization through things like declarations or conventions, but it's important to remember that even if norms are formalized in this manner, it's not necessarily the case that they have accompanying enforcement mechanisms. And so it really is a matter of thinking about international norms as these social norms that enforcement occurs through recognition of norm violation and social sort of penalties, rather than necessarily there being a legal penalty, strictly speaking. So is there an LGBT equality norm that we can pinpoint and we can talk about? Now, broadly, we often think about the LGBT equality norm kind of emerging with the Stonewall riots in New York City back in 1969. So in that case, in response to police brutality, there was several days of spontaneous resistance and riots by members of the LGBT community. Now, in terms of kind of American political science and thinking about the LGBT movement in America, this is seen as a very pivotal moment in the development of the movement. But even for those of us who live outside of the United States, we often still think about the Stonewall riots as being this pivotal launching point for the global movement for LGBT equality. Now, that being said, there's no firm consensus among scholars who study LGBT politics about precisely when an LGBT norm sort of emerged at the global level. Broadly, we think it's in the 1980s and 1990s, and these are kind of a few indicators of why that's probably a reasonable claim. So for instance, in 1990, the World Health Organization removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. In 1993, the ILGA, which is a really important global NGO promoting LGBT equality, it gained consultative status at the United Nations. And then even in 1995, with the Fourth World Conference on Women, LGBT equality was raised in this forum as well. So within the United Nations system, LGBT advocates have found ways to exercise influence over both the nature of the issues that are being raised in the system, but also the presentation of this information and lobbying amongst different countries. And so in many respects, these world conferences were these amazing opportunities for networking and for LGBT advocates to both identify allies for their cause and to ensure that these issues were raised among policymakers across the world. Now, since the 1990s, there have been some more recent efforts to formalize this LGBT equality norm. And what's often pointed to is the Jakarta principles, which were developed in 2006 and then updated again in 2017. Now, the people who put together these principles, their intention was to detail or provide a roadmap for applying existing international human rights law to the issue of sexual orientation and gender identity. So in this way, they weren't necessarily trying to create new international law. They were trying to clarify how existing rules could be used to help enforce this emerging norm. Interestingly, the principles were co-sponsored by Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, which may not be our expectations going into this. But it's important to also recognize that the principles have never been accepted within the United Nations. And so, in other words, despite repeated attempts to get gender identity and sexual orientation recognized as new categories of non-discrimination, these efforts have been repeatedly rebuffed by the UN General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council, and other UN bodies. So, all that being said, how can we empirically study this and other norms? So, for the LGBT equality norm, if we accept that the norm emerged in the early 1990s, then how can we go about comparing the adoption of the norm, say, over time and across different countries? And related to that, we can answer these broader questions then about how has the norm evolved and perhaps what explains this variation. So, how do we typically try to measure international norm adoption? Well, broadly, we can think about it in the sort of classic type of divide between small n research designs and large n research designs. So there are many scholars who approach this issue using a specific country case studies, let's say. And so in that context, it's possible to study the adoption of the norm in those particular countries, usually one or a small number. And through these research designs, we get really rich empirical detail about the process of adoption and the many different ways in which adoption of an international norm might manifest in that particular context. Of course, the trade-off with this, as many of us already know, is that we're limited in scope. We don't have the resources or the time to be able to conduct similarly detailed studies, say, in every country in the world. This is one particularly excellent example of insightful research on the adoption and diffusion of the LGBT equality norm by Kelly Coleman. And in her book, she looks at, for instance, Canada and Germany and how processes of adoption have differed in those countries. Now, for those of us in empirical social science who take more of a large end sort of perspective with our research, a different way of thinking about this is by using, say, a single indicator or a single proxy as an indicator of norm adoption. And so in this context, it might be the case that we use whether or not countries have ratified a particular convention, if we have records of votes on these issues within the United Nations General Assembly, it could be the case that we use those votes. It might even be the case that we pick maybe a theoretically important domestic law or policy to use as that indicator. So with the LGBT equality norm, maybe we want to keep track of things by focusing just on who's legalized same-sex marriage. Now, of course, there's trade-offs with this approach as well. So on the one hand, we're able to increase both the geographic and the temporal scope of our research. We can develop clear records of when particular votes were taken or particular laws were passed over time and across countries. But ultimately, this is also an imprecise measure, right? This is a single proxy of a complex norm that we've already established is dynamic and will evolve over time. So to provide a few examples of how this could play out, one example might be to say, focus on the decriminalization of homosexuality. And so these are three examples. If we look at Canada, this occurred in 1969. And for those of you who study Canadian politics, of course, this is a very famous trope, a quote by Trudeau at the time. If we look at, say, Mozambique and India, though, they decriminalized homosexuality in 2015 and 2018, respectively. And so this would paint one particular picture of the adoption of LGBT equality over time. What about same-sex marriage? Well, Canada legalized same-sex marriage in 2005, and that was followed up by the United States in 2015 and Australia in 2017. But again, if we think about what the norm means, what are the appropriate behaviors associated with the norm, if we use just the one indicator, we're going to get a very different picture of norm adoption across countries and across time if we use decriminalization of homosexuality on the one hand, or same-sex marriage on the other. The last example is prohibiting conversion therapy. And so this is a much more recent policy initiative, if you will. Malta was one of the first countries to prohibit conversion therapy in 2016. Germany did so in 2020. And there's speculation that New Zealand will follow suit in 2021. So again, if we use this as our indicator of norm adoption, perhaps it provides a better picture of how we interpret the appropriate behavior in the contemporary context. However, by this measure, there's very few countries in the world that have adopted the norm. So again, we're faced with these trade-offs. So all of that being said, what can latent variable models contribute to empirical social science? Latent variable models is a broad class of models that we use to measure what are called latent variables. Latent variables are things that we can't directly observe, and we have to infer their existence from variables that we can observe. Now, originally, this type of modeling was developed in education and psychology. So a lot of the terminology that we associate with latent variable modeling reflects these origins. And so we often talk about items or questions as indicators, and we talk about testing ability or knowledge as the thing that we're trying to infer. Now, that being said, there are many different concepts in political science, and I would argue the broader social sciences that fit this type of description, right? Some examples here would include, say, democracy, class, ideology, and knowledge. And what these concepts have in common is that none of them can be directly observed, but they're important concepts, and we know that they have important relationships with other concepts that we're interested in. More specifically, say, we can't directly observe democracy, but we can see its manifestations. So let's quickly walk through an example of what this looks like. So as an example, I'll use political knowledge. And so I'm interested in knowing how much does someone know about politics. Now, political knowledge by itself is an important concept, and we know that it could relate to a lot of political behaviors that we're also interested in. For instance, it might be the case that people with high levels of political knowledge are more likely to vote in elections, or they're more likely to run for political office. Now, since we can't directly observe political knowledge, we have to think about ways that we can collect data on individuals that would allow us to make claims about what their level of political knowledge likely is. So to do so, one approach we can take is within a branch of models known as item response theory. So there are two key ideas behind item response theory that I want to talk about today. The first is this basic idea that individuals will possess a latent or unobservable level of knowledge, and we can measure their level of knowledge through a set of questions. So this sort of idea should, I think, be pretty intuitive to all of us who have ever had to, say, take a test in school, right? If we think back to how we studied math back in high school or elementary school, the teacher wanted to know how much math we knew, and so they would ask us a set of questions on a math test. Now, for each question, individuals are predicted to answer correctly if they have a certain level of ability or level of knowledge in this case. And if they're above that threshold, we would expect them to answer correctly. If they're below that threshold, we would expect them to answer incorrectly. And just to clarify the terminology in this type of literature, this threshold, this difficulty threshold, is known as the difficulty of the question. So here's one example of what that might look like. So in this made-up example, I've come up with 4 questions to determine an individual's level of political knowledge in Canada. And so somebody would take this test and be forced to answer, who is Canada's Prime Minister, how many provinces are there, how many federal ridings exist, and who is Canada's Governor General, which I realize after yesterday's news, that last one is a little bit of a trick question. And so we can imagine that all of these questions relate then to a single dimension with low levels of political knowledge on the one end, and then high levels of political knowledge on the other end. And so here are 3 people who took the test for me. And the first person that you see on the left is somebody who got that first question correct, but didn't get any of the other questions correct. And so we would estimate their level of knowledge as being to the right of the first question, but to the left of the remaining questions, since he or she didn't get those questions correct. The second person you see is right there in the middle. They got the first 2 questions correct, but didn't get the second 2 questions correct. And then the final person you see on the end there is somebody who got all 4 questions correct. So we would estimate that they have the highest level of knowledge. So what does this actually tell us? Well, this tells us, or allows us, to estimate the individual level of knowledge of each person who took that test. And we can do so with some degree of uncertainty. So in other words, we recognize that as hard as we try, the questions that we develop will always be imperfect measures of that latent dimension. And so we recognize that we're doing our best to make a claim about the person's level of knowledge, but there's always going to be some uncertainty in doing so. The second thing that we can gather from that is with respect to the question difficulty. So we can actually empirically determine how difficult questions are relative to each other. And again, we can do so with some degree of uncertainty. So to bring all the pieces together here that I've talked about so far, how can we improve our approach to measuring international norms? And so if it's the case, as I've claimed earlier, that international norm adoption is a huge part of research in international relations and political science, but our existing empirical approach to measuring international norms is either limited in scope or provides a very imprecise or noisy measure of norm adoption, then I argue in this research that we can bring together latent variable modeling with research on international norms to provide a more effective bridge between how we theoretically think about international norms and our empirical strategies for studying them. So to provide a bit of clarity in moving from the context of political knowledge to the context of norm adoption, I made this table to help with the translation process. So if we think about IRT models in terms of, well, who are we focused on? In the political knowledge example, we were interested in people taking the survey or the test. In the context of norm adoption, I argue that the equivalent to the person is a country year. So rather than trying to consider my level of political knowledge, for example, we're interested in the level of norm adoption by Canada in 2010. The second component then is the latent variable or the latent trait. In the political knowledge example, we were interested in somebody's level of political knowledge. But in the norm adoption application, we're interested in the degree of norm adoption by the country in that year. The indicators that we use in the political knowledge example were all questions. We asked people questions about their political knowledge or question about their math knowledge or anything like that. In the norm adoption example, we're instead going to use policies or laws that a country has adopted. And similarly, when we're interested in the difficulty of the questions, in the norm adoption example, we're now interested in the difficulty of the policy or laws as they relate to that broader norm. So in this application with the LGBT equality norm, I used data from 196 different countries between the years of 1990 and 2017. The reason for that particular time frame, like I mentioned earlier, there's no firm consensus about what year the international norm emerged, other than to say somewhere in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So the year 1990 specifically is somewhat arbitrary, but it's justified by this broader literature. Similarly, on the more recent end, 2017, when I first started working on this paper, was the most recent year for which we had available data. Now, that being said, there were 13 domestic policies and laws that I used from the ILGA. More specifically, the ILGA collects and produces reports on the extent of adoption of LGBT policies and laws throughout the world. From these reports, I identified 13 specific policies and laws that we could reliably assess over time. Now, some of you might already be thinking, well, why not use a more conventional international indicator of adoption of an international norm, like ratifying conventions or votes in the UN General Assembly? So my argument on that front, at least, is that in order to develop a more generalizable approach to measuring norms, we're probably unlikely to find appropriate international indicators. So to use the example of a vote in the UN General Assembly, it may be the case that a vote was held on an issue related to LGBT equality in one particular year. But that only gives us information about how countries perhaps voted on that issue in that one year. And so if we're trying to develop a more temporal understanding of the evolution of the norm, we're not actually able to collect that much information. So these are the 13 indicators that I used from the ILGA reports. And I know there's a lot of text on this particular slide, and I apologize for that. But it's important to at least briefly go through the specific indicators and see that they cover the sort of full range of behavior that might be associated with the LGBT equality norm. So on the one end, we have something that by contemporary standards seems quite straightforward, which is legalizing homosexuality. And then on the other end, we have something that's much more progressive in the contemporary time period, which is a ban on conversion therapy. And so in between these sorts of extremes, we have everything from not banning LGBT NGOs to policies or laws about adoption rights, or even establishing a constitutional prohibition on discrimination based on sexual orientation. Now, I'm happy to answer more specific questions about the model itself during the Q&A, but for being at least, I just wanted to summarize the model as it's a Bayesian dynamic item response theory model. And so what this means is I've used a dynamic prior on the latent trait, which is, again, in this context, the degree of norm adoption over time. And then I link this dynamic prior to domestic patterns of regime change. And in doing so, I seek to operationalize what we anticipate to be the temporal patterns of change and stability. So in other words, a dynamic prior in this context is a way of making a claim about our best guess about the likely value or the likely extent of norm adoption in a particular country. And what this allows us to do is say, if we look at Canada in say 2010, I have pre-existing knowledge about the degree of Canada's norm adoption in 2009, and I'm going to use that information to inform my guess for what it's likely to be then in 2010. So what might this type of approach tell us theoretically? So this is just a stylized illustration of what we might find, but we can see that if we take all of the measures of country norm adoption in a particular year, and then we produce density plots, they could look something like this. And so in the top left panel, you see what might be characterized as norm adoption, where most of the countries are clustered at the higher end of the norm adoption scale. On the other hand, though, in the top right, you see what might be called norm rejection, if most of the countries are clustered at the lower end of the norm adoption scale. But patterns could be much more complex than that. In the bottom left, you see what might be called something like norm polarization, if we see a clear split in how countries are grouped together. Or it could be possible that we see a relatively even distribution of countries across this scale, in which case perhaps that's a period of transition. And so it's important to remember that this is just a single year snapshot. And like I mentioned earlier, we think about norms as being these dynamic things that can change over time with dynamic patterns of adoption. So we might move, for instance, from a period of norm rejection in the top right, to a period of polarization, to one of a transition, to one of adoption. There's a lot of different ways in which norms might empirically evolve over time. So to provide a snapshot of some of the results that I was able to produce through this approach to measuring the LGBT equality norm, these are just 3 countries that I pulled. You could use any of the countries from the 196, but these are interesting for a variety of reasons. On the one hand, we often think of the Netherlands as being a leader in norm adoption with LGBT rights more broadly. They were the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. Like I mentioned earlier, Uganda is more recently seen as a focal point for pushing back against the LGBT equality norm. And the United Kingdom is interesting in terms of how quickly its position has changed with respect to LGBT equality. And so what we can see here is that each point represents our best guess for that country's degree of norm adoption in that particular year. And we have a credible interval around it to characterize our uncertainty about that guess. Now we can see a few interesting components here. With the United Kingdom, for example, like I mentioned, its position has changed quite rapidly over the course of the 2000s. And this is partially a function of several new policies and laws that were adopted in the UK during this period. But at the same time, if we look at, say, the Netherlands and Uganda, you can see that they both dip, albeit in different ways, just in the last couple of years. And so in these cases, it's not necessarily the case that these countries have, say, repealed particular laws that were favorable to LGBT rights. Instead, if we think back to this idea that norms can evolve over time in terms of the appropriate behavior associated with the norm, and we think about this in more relative terms, we can see that, well, as other countries were adopting increasingly progressive policies and laws related to LGBT equality, these particular countries weren't keeping pace. In other words, the meaning of the norm and the appropriate behaviors change over time. And so by not keeping pace with the new behaviors, it manifests in our measure of their degree of norm adoption diminishing. Now, if we took a look at the global results, like I was talking about with our theoretical expectations earlier, we can see that if we take single year snapshots of each country's measure of norm adoption, and we group them together in these density plots, we can see that in 2001, when same-sex marriage was first legalized, we could pretty reasonably characterize the distribution as polarized. We can see very 2 clear peaks here. However, as we move from 2001 to 2009 and up to 2017, we can see that this degree of polarization is actually decreasing over time. And I would argue that we're starting to see what might be approximated as more of a transition. In other words, it could be the case that we are gradually moving towards wider adoption of the norm. But of course, we can't foresee the future. It could be the case that this is going to be a period that looks like a transition and will ultimately end up going back to polarization or maybe even rejection. The last component of the results that I want to talk about is how we think about the difficulty of the policies and laws that we estimate. And so, again, this is a critical piece of tying our empirical study to our theoretical understanding. And so if it's the case that we anticipate that the meaning of the norm will shift over time, that some behaviors will become more associated with the norm and perhaps others are rejected, we can see how that manifests here. And so the easiest policies to adopt, if you will, are the ones on the left-hand side. So things like legalizing homosexuality. The degree of difficulty associated with that in relation to the norm has been fairly steady over time. However, we can see that there are quite a few policies or laws that have become easier to adopt over time. So in other words, they become more commonplace with respect to behaviors associated with the norm. At the far end of the scale here, we can see that conversion therapy bans are still very difficult so to speak, to adopt. And so in other words, if a country has adopted a ban on conversion therapy, that's a very sort of strong signal of the degree of norm adoption in that country. Now, of course, I fully recognize that not all of you are likely to be LGBT scholars or interested in the LGBT norm. Can we think about then how we might apply this approach to norms more broadly? And so I would argue that if it's the case that we're interested in what's kind of referred to as a state-centric norm, we can quite easily use this approach to measuring norm adoption. And so it's simply a matter of identifying a set of theoretically appropriate domestic policies or laws associated with that norm. Of course, we're not just limited to state-centric norms. We could also think about applying this approach to measuring norm adoption to, say, non-state actors. So maybe it's the case that we're really interested in the extent to which international organizations have adopted a norm over time. And so if we were able to collect data on those organizations for indicators of that particular norm, in principle, we could apply the same approach. Now, what if it's the case that we want to study multiple norms? Well, in the theoretical literature on international norms, we increasingly recognize that there might exist distinct norms, but they're very closely related to each other. So is it possible to adapt this approach to those types of instances? So as an example, I focus here on LGBT equality or sexual orientation. It could be the case that norms related to gender identity are very much related, but also distinct. They manifest in a separate set of policies or laws. And so we could think about possibly using what's known as multidimensional scaling in order to measure the adoption of the norm across countries with respect to these two distinct but related norms in a single unified model. Ultimately, what I'm proposing here, I believe, provides a more principled, theoretical, and empirical approach to measuring international norm adoption. But it's not an approach that's unique to the LGBT equality norm. It actually provides a framework for measuring norms across a variety of different contexts. It doesn't have to be state-centric norms. It could even relate to norms that are involved with civil society organizations, international organizations, and so on. And so ultimately, I believe that this offers quite a few new opportunities for both developing new theoretical insights and possibly offering new opportunities for multi-method research designs as well. And I'm very excited to share with all of you the paper in which I've developed this research. I recently got its issue and journal number, and so the citation information is here if you'd like to follow up with that paper specifically. But thank you again, all of you, for taking the time to join today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Tyler. So are there questions? There was one question that came up about kind of the, oh yeah, Tom, by all means.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So Tyler, great presentation. Thanks so much for coming. So I'm a comparativist, and I'm going to ask sort of the obvious question. The research here that you've presented is sort of about the latent degree of norm adoption, right, which is obviously very important to IR scholars and whatnot. But again, sort of as a comparativist, I'm wondering whether like this outcome variable is what, you know, LGBTQ advocates would really be interested in understanding, right? Sort of like there's a distinction between the norms that are adopted at a national level and whether or not these norms are actually, these laws that are passed, for example, matter for LGBTQ people within a particular country, especially because in in developing democracies and competitive authoritarian regimes, sort of like talk is cheap, right? So this might just be like an IR game, right, that is being played with fairly little consequence to citizens and the like. So I was wondering if you could like sort of talk about, connect those two things a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Tom. That's an awesome question, and I'm really glad you raised it. Broadly, we understand international norms as very sort of complex things, and More specifically, they might manifest in terms of the policies and laws that are adopted, which is what I focused on. But I completely agree with you that there's an equally important component to this in terms of how norms are actually implemented, right? Like you said, talk is cheap, and some of these policies and laws could be adopted for more superficial reasons. And so I wouldn't make any claims about this being able to provide the sort of singular measure of norm adoption across countries. Instead, I think there's a really important opportunity here to think about some of the divergences that we might see in terms of, here's a sort of more formal adoption of the norm in a particular country. And by comparison, how is the norm being implemented in terms of, say, the implementation of the policies or the everyday lives of people within that country? A different way we could maybe think about it as well is, well, what is the role of public opinion, right? Is it the case that changes in public opinion are leading to changes in more formal adoption of the norm within the country? Or maybe it's working the other way, that formal adoption of the norm, even if it is superficial and cheap talk at first, is a signal, and it helps to shift attitudes within that country over time. And so to that extent, I think this is where multi-method research is actually so important, in that we can, on the one hand, develop these measures of more formal adoption of the norm across the country, but at the same time, it's the more detailed, qualitative research that might help to shed light then on the very real everyday experiences of people in that country as well.
Thanks. I yeah, go ahead, Tom, a follow-up.
Sorry, so I was thinking a little bit about whether or not, sure, like qualitative work would be awesome in that regard, but there are also quantitative ways in which we could test whether or not sort of like, I'm interested in particularly like the way that you like frame sort of like certain laws being hard or easy depending on and how that changes over time. And so sort of like you could test through some quantitative methods whether or not adoption of of what would be an easy, law or whatever to pass in later years is associated with changes in public opinion about, these sorts of groups. And so sort of that occurred to me, and you might be working on this, but I thought that would be something interesting to do. Anyways, that was more of a comment than a question. But.
Oh no, thank you, Tom. I completely agree. And at least with trying to take different types of quantitative approaches, I mean, it could be the case that we can think through an appropriate experimental design to start to get at these ideas. But there's also a gentleman in Glasgow, Chris Claessens, who's developed a way to build smooth country year panels of public opinion. So in other words, it might only be the case that we have, say, public opinion polls on support for homosexuality in Canada in 4 of the last 20 years. And so it's hard to kind of assess the degree of norm adoption as I've measured it with changes in public opinion over time. And so he's used a really cool approach to, again, adapting item response theory to combine public opinion polls together over time to create a more smooth, continuous measure of public opinion. So that would be, I'm hoping that's kind of an area of future research of my own that we can start to think about bringing these different pieces together.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is I was wondering if there was some way to do something that was multi-level and brought in public opinion on the different policy dimensions, including kind of the errors around that public opinion, like how tight or loose they are, to have it be like a multi-level and kind of fold in the attitudes as well. So it sounds like, we're a little ways from that, but someone's working on it. Smart people are working on it. So I'm excited about that.
Exactly.
Other questions? Well, that was going to be my question, is essentially, is there some way to kind of incorporate more of social indicators, whether it's public opinion or there might be data sets out there about kind of the availability of local NGOs that are working in this policy or this topic area, that you could add additional information to get beyond just the formal policy adoption.
Absolutely. I definitely think there's an opportunity for that. And then to perhaps seize on your multi-level expertise. There's also, important things that we need to think about in, say, federal systems, right, compared to unitary systems. And how do we think about if provinces in Canada adopt particular anti-discrimination pieces of legislation, but not at the federal level. Like, is there a way to build that into how we think about measuring just national adoption of the norm? Right?
Mm-hmm. And my sense is that the bigger challenge in general in studying this topic is that, which I think is a little bit what Tom's question was getting at, is that there's the formal adoption, and then there's the implementation and enforcement of, and the actual outcomes and the lived experiences of people's everyday lives. And we just don't, as of yet, have reliable, kind of comparable data about enforcement or about socioeconomic outcomes of LGBT plus peoples outside of a handful of advanced industrialized democracies, right? So we have to get the norms on the books before you can kind of start measuring the extent to which there's a gap between kind of what is said and what is done on the ground with regard to these rights.
Absolutely.
Other questions?
Sarah has a quick question, Michelle.
Oh, yeah. Estera, please do.
It's a methodological question. I was wondering if you considered other multi-method frameworks outside of IRT when you first approached this topic, and yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I guess to provide just a little bit of backstory for this, this actually started as an assignment in the measurement workshop at ICPSR. And so for that particular assignment, this whole thing started within a Moken scaling framework, which is a non-parametric version of item response theory. But in trying to learn about these different techniques and focus specifically on the LGBT equality norm, it quickly became apparent that item response theory provided a very sort of intuitive and robust way of modeling the relationship between the observed outcomes that we see and the latent dimension that we're trying to measure.
Okay, thank you for answering the question. And thank you for the presentation as well. It was interesting.
If someone was interested in getting started with these models or learning more about their application, is there, to your mind, Tyler, like the go-to resource or book or article that kind of gives a good overview of how to get started?
Yeah, so I would say that it depends a little bit on your level of comfort with quantitative methods already. But that being said, there's the second edition of a book by Dave Armstrong, who's at Western, and a set of co-authors. The name is escaping me now, but basically they provide a sort of Bayesian tutorial of many applications of different measurement models in political science, as well as code and data and examples that walk people through that. So you could actually essentially learn the exact model that I use in this particular paper through just a couple of the chapters in that particular book. And so I apologize, I cannot remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but Dave Armstrong is one of the co-authors on the book.
And I think Ryan Baker, Bakker, is also another co-author. So between Dave Armstrong, Ryan Baker, and scaling, I think, is somewhere in the title, you're probably going to be able to find it. I think it might be a Springer book, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, it basically has all the measurement people in political science. Chris Hare and some others as well. Yeah.
So that would probably be a very detailed treatment. Also, the data and code that Tyler used in the paper are available on the APSR replication website, the Dataverse. So you would also be able to kind of download Tyler's data and look at and unpack and see the code and the model and the results and line those up with the paper if you wanted to kind of have a practice go and see how it works.
Absolutely. And if anybody has any questions about that, I'm absolutely happy to help however I can.
Replication is often a good thing, Tom. Anything else? I don't want to cut this short too early. Well, okay. Thanks again. I'm just going to thank everyone again for joining us for this talk. And thank you again, Tyler, for sharing your research with us. It was a great overview of the method and introduction to your specific application in this case. And I wish everyone a great weekend. So take care and stay safe.
Happy birthday, Michelle.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Yeah, take care.